a news flash from the Brisbane newsroom. Widespread erosion is occurring on large areas of Queensland. Reports from affected areas indicate that valuable resources have already been lost and large areas have been destroyed. Damage is estimated to run into millions of dollars. Local residents are battling with blocked roads and polluted reservoirs. Farmers could be forced to leave their land, placing food sources in jeopardy. The threat of soil erosion is expected to consume more prime agricultural land every day unless tighter measures are taken against it.
Soil is one of our most valuable and scarce natural resources. It's valuable because without the soil, much of what we use in our daily lives, food, clothing and housing materials, would not exist. And it's scarce because land with fertile soil and sufficient rainfall for crops and pasture is limited. Almost 1/3 of the Australian continent is made up of deserts, mountain ranges and water bodies which are non-productive. Of the remaining suitable lands, some is taken up by cities and towns, highways and industrial development. Other prime land is needed for national parks and forests, along with recreation areas such as council parks, picnic grounds and sporting fields. Most of the remaining land is used for growing crops and for grazing. About 2/3 of this land, however, has low levels of productivity and can support only a small part of our valuable agriculture. This green area represents the rest of the productive land that's left for our use now and in the future. And it's gradually being eroded away. In fact, already half of it needs soil conservation treatment. If more is not done to conserve this precious resource, our limited, highly productive land will eventually be blown and washed away. Maintaining and protecting our soils is vital. If agricultural soils are neglected, supplies of farm produce will be limited, and the price of food, clothing and building materials will rise. And as population increases, so will the demand for these products. New land will have to be opened up for cropping and grazing. Some of this land won't be as suitable as land being used now, and so will be even more costly to manage. Eventually, if erosion is not checked, productive land may end up like this. Soil erosion is not always dramatic. You can hardly see this sheet and rill erosion, but it's just as damaging if it's not controlled. Erosion can also occur in cities, on building sites, in playgrounds, and even in our own backyards. Land that is used correctly will continue to supply us with products for many years. This fertile soil has a low risk of erosion because proper soil conservation measures have been taken. These rich soils of the Queensland Darling Downs should continue to bear good harvests for local consumption and export as long as the topsoil is maintained and protected. Natural factors such as soil type, rainfall, slope and vegetation determine how susceptible an area is to erosion. Some types of land are more prone to soil erosion than others. Poor management of agricultural land will also increase the likelihood of erosion. On this hillside, many years of farming have resulted in the loss of most of the productive soil from the top part of the slope. Some of this topsoil has formed a mound at the bottom of the paddock. Most of it, however, has been washed further down and finally ended up in the river. The loss of soil here happens slowly and might not be noticed, unlike these gullies and bare patches. It'll be many years before these scars heal, even though this hillside is now being returned to grassland to stabilise the soil. This land on the Darling Downs is also badly eroded. Damage like this is sometimes caused by poor farming and grazing practices. In Queensland, water is the major cause of erosion, although wind can cause serious problems in the drier areas of the state. Soil can be protected from wind and water erosion in many ways. Maintaining a cover on soil prevents it from being washed away. Raindrops detach soil particles that are exposed and carry them away in runoff water. Vegetation cover, however, absorbs the impact of the raindrops, so soil particles are not dislodged. Any type of vegetation cover will protect topsoil. Other ways of protecting topsoil on farming lands are to build contour banks on slopes to slow down and redirect runoff water, or to cultivate on the contour rather than up and down the slope so that the water has time to soak in. On more level ground, growing crops in strips slows down runoff. This farm on the Darling Downs is growing crops in some strips and leaving stubble or bare ground in others.
I've been farming all my life. The majority of that time, I've been dairy farming. To me, soil conservation is absolutely necessary because without soil, there'd be no crops. And without crops, I'd have no income. When I arrived here 5 years ago, the property had been divided into a number of paddocks, all radiating from a central lane. And this setup had caused severe erosion. So I asked the personnel from the soil conservation at the DPI to help me plan the property. When I went to implement the plan, I realised it had to be complete dedication to the project, otherwise it would have been worthless starting it. The old fences had to be pulled down. The old fence lines where the soil had built up against them over the past years had to be levelled out. And then the contour lines had to be drawn out. All this required about 12 months' work before I was able to bring in a bulldozer to push up the first bank. One great problem I had was finding the correct position for a waterway. We ended up using the old laneway as a waterway, which served quite admirably, as a matter of fact. It's very important that the waterway be allowed to grass over because it is the sole source of taking the water from the property. If it becomes unstable, water will tend to erode it out in various patches and severe maintenance work will be necessary to be able to grass it again. Just because we have contour banks and good waterways doesn't mean to say that all our erosion problems are solved. As a matter of fact, it's hardly begun. We've got to have good maintenance of our soil. We have to make sure that the soil is not robbed of its humus, make sure that our soil is worked properly, and apart from that too, that our banks and waterways are maintained correctly. I found it very important that I do not graze out paddocks severely, otherwise I won't have any stubble to retain the soil during the heavy rain. And I've found that trees are absolutely necessary in our soil conservation, so I've blocked off paddocks and the grass paddock there to allow the native trees to grow again. As a matter of fact, I've got one little corner there with some young trees coming away quite nicely now.
Soil erosion affects everyone, including those of us in cities and towns. Eroded soil from agricultural land is deposited on roads and blocks culvert holes. As well as being a danger to drivers, it's expensive and time-consuming to remove. Railway lines and even highways can be threatened. Millions of tons of our valuable farming soil are carried into creeks and rivers after every storm. This causes them to silt up and may lead to erosive flooding and changes in stream size, endangering those who live nearby. Deposits of silt from eroded land also pollute our major water supplies. Runoff water often contains pesticides and fertilizers, as well as soil particles, and these can find their way into farm dams and town water reservoirs. This causes water pollution, poor water quality, and excessive water plant growth. Silt, weed, and other impurities must be removed from water before it can be used. This greatly increases the cost of our water. Many millions of dollars have to be spent each year dredging the silt out of shipping channels in our rivers and ports. Soil erosion affects our future. If agricultural lands are not conserved, supplies will become limited and prices will escalate. Even our export market will be affected. In fact, the total productivity of our nation could be threatened. But erosion on the land and its effects on cities can be controlled and even prevented, providing we understand why it occurs and take action before it's too late. Whether we're building a suburban home or managing a farm or property, controlling soil erosion is our responsibility.
You're looking after your soil well there, Stephen, aren't you? I feel very strongly about soil conservation. If we are going to look after our soil, we're going to have to start right now. I intend looking after my soil because I want it for my son's future. What are you going to do about soil conservation?
Soil conservation is everybody's responsibility, since it affects the future of the entire nation.